Right now, many argue the SEC is the best conference in college football, and statistically, their games are at least the most exciting. It's very difficult to dispute that fact, as pretty much all their games come down to the wire, but 10 years ago, what did the SEC look like? Things were honestly a whole lot different, and in today's video, we're going to do my annual flashback on how the SEC teams were doing at this point in the season. Some of them will surprise you, and some of them won't. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's go ahead and get started and talk about how every SEC school was doing a decade ago. Okay, so the first school I want to talk about is the Georgia Bulldogs. Things were so much different for Georgia back in 2015, as at this point in the season, they were coming off of a 27-3 loss against Florida. Faton Bauta had thrown for 4 interceptions in what might have been the worst starting performance in SEC history, and they were 5-3 with a 3-3 mark in the conference. That 2015 team was originally led by Grayson Lambert and Bryce Ramsey, but Bauta got a chance. Sony Michel and Nick Chubb were the star running backs, and Malcolm Mitchell and Terry Godwin were the main receivers. Georgia had already lost games to Tennessee and Alabama that season, and after a 9-6 victory over Mizzou, things were looking terrible. That game against Florida was the nail in the coffin of the Mark Richt era, and pretty shortly after, they would announce they'd hire Kirby Smart, but they would win their last 4 games of the season against Kentucky, Auburn, Georgia Southern, and Georgia Tech, and then they also beat Penn State in the Tax Slayer Bowl. They were bad at this point in the season, but they had fixed it. For our second team, let's talk about the team that had just beaten Georgia, the Florida Gators. Back in 2015, they were in their first year under head coach Jim McElwain, who had come over from Colorado State. Florida was led by Trayon Harris at quarterback, and then guys like Kelvin Taylor and Antonio Callaway were the main skill players. If you couldn't remember, Will Grier was actually the starter before he ended up getting suspended. Florida was off to a great start with wins over New Mexico State, East Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, number 3 Ole Miss, and Mizzou. They had just lost a close game to number 6 LSU before that meeting with Georgia, and they beat the Bulldogs 27-3 to get off to a 7-1 record with a 5-1 mark in the SEC. That's where they were 10 years ago. To finish the season, they ended up beating Vanderbilt, South Carolina, and Florida Atlantic, who they had to take to overtime, before losing to Florida State in their final regular season game. They'd end up facing off with Bama in the SEC title game, and it wasn't really all that close, and then they got killed by Michigan in the Citrus Bowl. Honestly, Florida was pretty much peaking at this point in the 2015 season, and it was kind of downhill from there. Things have changed a lot for Vanderbilt since 2015, as back then, Derek Mason was their head coach. While things are going well for them now, they weren't going well for them then. Johnny McCrary was the quarterback then, with Ralph Webb being their star running back. They did have a superstar linebacker in Zach Cunningham, but the Commodores didn't have a great season up to this point. They lost early games to Western Kentucky and Georgia, and also lost close ones to Ole Miss and South Carolina. They ended up having close wins over Mizzou and Middle Tennessee, and exactly 10 years ago, they faced off with number 18 Houston on the road and got shut out 34-0. Vanderbilt was 3-5 at this point with a 1-3 mark in the SEC, and things wouldn't really improve. They ended up getting shut out by A&M, lost by 2 to Florida, got murdered by Tennessee, and their only win came in a 4-point victory over Kentucky. Vandy ended up finishing with a 4-8 record and a 2-6 mark in the conference, and things have changed a lot for them, and they're in a much better spot 10 years later. 10 years ago for the Ole Miss Rebels, they were also in a really good spot, as they were ranked number 19 in the country. They ended up beating Auburn 27-19 10 years ago, but going back to the 2015 season, it looked a whole lot different. Hugh Freeze was the head coach, Chad Kelly threw for over 4,000 yards, and they had star players like Jalen Walton at running back, Laquan Treadwell at receiver, and Evan Ingram. Ole Miss was a lot of fun, and they got off to a 4-0 start with wins over Vanderbilt, Bama, Fresno State, and UT Martin. After losses against both Memphis and Florida, they sort of fell off a bit, but a win over number 15 Texas A&M got them to where they were 10 years ago, where they ended up beating Auburn on the road 27-19. From there, they lost that ridiculous game against Arkansas, where Hunter Henry had that miracle pass to Alex Collins, and then to finish the season, they beat 3 straight ranked teams in number 15 LSU, number 21 Mississippi State, and number 16 Oklahoma State. Ole Miss ended up going 10-3 with a 6-2 mark in the conference, and they had a really good season. Speaking of the team that Ole Miss faced off with, the Auburn Tigers, they were in an interesting spot too. Gus Malzahn was the head coach at that time, and they had some issues figuring out the quarterback position. After starting out with Jeremy Johnson, he flamed out and Sean White took over as the starter. Auburn also had a good defense, and after starting out with a win against Louisville, they almost blew it at home to Jacksonville State. From there, they got exposed in SEC play as they lost to LSU, Mississippi State, and Arkansas, so they limped into that game against Ole Miss with a 4-3 record with a 1-3 mark in the conference. They ended up falling to 500 and a 1-4 mark 10 years ago. Then they ended up beating number 19 Texas A&M on the road before losing 2 of 3 against Georgia and Bama, and then beating Memphis in the Birmingham Bowl. In total, Auburn went 7-6 with a 2-6 mark in the conference, and then they went out and got a decent quarterback in Jarrett Stidham. This time 10 years ago, South Carolina faced off with Texas A&M. At the time, the Gamecocks were led by quarterback Perry Orth, and Brandon Wilds and Pharaoh Cooper were the main skill players. But to start out the season, it was interesting for them. They beat North Carolina on a neutral site before then losing 4 of their next 5 against Kentucky, Georgia, Mizzou, and LSU. Their lone SEC win of the year came against Vanderbilt, and after a bye week, they faced off with A&M 10 years ago. They ended up losing this game 35-28 and fell to a 3-5 record with a 1-5 mark in the SEC. They then finished the season with 4 straight losses, one of which came against the Citadel. And then you had 2 against ranked teams, including number 1 Clemson, and then a 3-point loss to Tennessee. The Gamecocks ended up going 3-9 with a 1-7 mark in the conference, and it was a disaster, especially that Citadel game. The team that Carolina faced off with was Texas A&M, and at the time, Kyler Murray was the starting quarterback for the Aggies. They had rotated between Murray, Kyle Allen, and Jake Hubenock, and they were led by Trey Carson at running back, who ended up being really solid, and then 3 future NFL receivers in Ricky Seals-Jones, Josh Reynolds, and Christian Kirk. They had plenty of potential, but A&M was just not able to live up to it. After beating number 15 ASU in Week 1, they would rally off 4 straight wins against Ball State, Nevada, Arkansas, and Mississippi State before dropping 2 games against Bama and Ole Miss. They limped into the South Carolina game on a 2-game losing streak, but they ended up getting right there before then losing to Auburn. To finish the year, they beat Western Carolina and Vanderbilt before losing to LSU in the final regular season game. They would then play Louisville in the Music City Bowl, losing by 1 possession, and A&M would finish with an 8-5 record and a 4-4 mark in the conference, which ended up being a disappointing year for Kevin Sumlin. Arkansas in 2025 is in a terrible spot right now, but in 2015, things were going a bit better. They had a star quarterback in Brandon Allen, a star running back in Alex Collins, and then 2 good receivers in Drew Morgan and future NFL tight end Hunter Henry. Arkansas started the season with a win over UTEP before dropping a home game against Toledo. I still remember that game. They lost 2 more to Texas Tech and A&M before getting their first SEC win against Tennessee. After a loss against Bama, they were 2-4 with a 1-2 mark in the conference, but then Arkansas got hot. They ended up beating Auburn in 4 overtimes, and then 10 years ago to the day, they beat Tennessee Martin 63-28 to get to a 4-4 mark. After that, they beat number 18 Ole Miss in overtime with that crazy Hunter Henry heave, and then they beat number 9 LSU and Mizzou. Their one loss came by 1 point against Mississippi State, and the Razorbacks went 7-5 in the regular season before beating K-State in the Liberty Bowl, and they ended up finishing 8-5. That was Brett Bielema's best season in my opinion, and now they can't even win a conference game in 2025. 10 years ago, it looked like Butch Jones was going to be the answer at Tennessee. As to this weekend, they ended up beating Kentucky 52-21. The Volunteers were led by their new star quarterback in Josh Dobbs, plus their dynamic duo at running back in Jalen Hurd and Alvin Kamara. Just crazy to me. They also had Vaughn Pearson and Josh Malone at the receiver spot, and Tennessee started the season with a win over Bowling Green before blowing it against Baker Mayfield in Oklahoma in double overtime. They then end up losing 2 of their next 3 games against Florida and Arkansas before beating Georgia for the first time in a little bit. That was big for them. After losing by 5 against Bama, they'd face off with Kentucky, and in a bounce-back game, they won 52-21 to get back to 4-4 in the conference. To finish the year, they'd beat South Carolina, North Texas, Mizzou, and Vanderbilt as they go 8-4 with a 5-3 mark in the SEC, and then beat number 13 Northwestern in the Outback Bowl. Tennessee ended up going 9-4, and this was a huge momentum season for Butch Jones, which would springboard into one of the most hyped seasons in recent memory for Tennessee in 2016, but they flamed out in the back half of 2016. The team that Tennessee ended up playing was Kentucky. 10 years ago, Kentucky also looked like a very different team. Patrick Towles was the starting quarterback, Stanley Boom Williams was the starting running back, and Garrett Johnson was the go-to wide receiver. The Wildcats were not very explosive then, and they aren't very explosive now, but they were starting to improve under Coach Stoops. They actually won 4 of their first 5 games, beating Mizzou, Eastern Kentucky, South Carolina, and Louisiana, with their one loss being against Florida. Sadly, the losing would really begin as they dropped 2 more games against Auburn and Mississippi State before 10 years ago they played against Tennessee. They got blown out in that game, and then they got beat soundly by Georgia, somehow lost to Vanderbilt, and then beat Charlotte before then losing to their rival Louisville 38-24. Kentucky ended up going 5-7 with a 2-6 mark in the SEC, and they failed to make a bowl game, and it was not a good year for them. I'm not going to talk about Oklahoma and Texas because they were not in the SEC 10 years ago, but one of the last schools we'll talk about is the Missouri Tigers. Back in 2015, they were fresh off of back-to-back SEC title appearances, and true freshman quarterback Drew Lock was leading the way. Ish Witter and Russell Hansbrough were the top 2 running backs, and Jamon Moore would end up becoming their top playmaker. This would end up being the last season of the Gary Pinkel era, as after beating SEMO, Arkansas State, and UConn to start out the season, the offense sputtered. They ended up losing against Kentucky, and their lone SEC win came against South Carolina. They then lose to Florida, lose by 3 against Georgia, lose 10-3 against Vanderbilt, and then 10 years ago they were on bye. To finish the season, they would lose in a monsoon game to Mississippi State, and then somehow beat BYU on a neutral site. They ended up losing their last home game of the Pinkel era against Tennessee 19-8, before getting beat by Arkansas 28-3. As I said, Gary Pinkel ended up retiring after the season, and Mizzou went 5-7 with a 1-7 mark in the conference. It was not good. For Mississippi State, they were still under head coach Dan Mullen and led by star quarterback Dak Prescott. Fred Ross ended up being the go-to receiver for them, but Dak was most of the offense that year. In 2015, they ended up beating Southern Miss to start out the year before losing by 2 against LSU. They then beat Northwestern State and Auburn before then losing to A&M. They just couldn't consistently rally off wins. That was until the month of October. They ended up beating Troy, Louisiana Tech, and Kentucky before then beating Mizzou to go on a 4-game winning streak. They were on bye 10 years ago to the day, but facing off with number 2 Bama in a super hyped up game, they got blown out. They then beat Arkansas 51-50 before losing in the Egg Bowl 38-27 to go 8-4 in the regular season. They would then play against NC State in the Belk Bowl, and they'd end up going 9-4, which was a super successful year for them. And now we get to our last 2 schools, and the first one is the LSU Tigers. All the way back in 2015, the LSU offense was a lot different, as they were led by Brandon Harris at quarterback and then their superstar running back Leonard Fournette. LSU ended up starting out the season with a game that was canceled against McNeese State before beating 2 ranked teams in Mississippi State and Auburn, and then also beating Syracuse. They would defeat Eastern Michigan and South Carolina before a matchup with a top 10 Florida team. They'd win that game by 7 points and then beat WKU before they were on bye 10 years ago. They then would face off with number 4 Alabama, and they got beat 30-16, and that would start a 3-game losing streak for them. They then lost to Arkansas and number 22 Ole Miss, and the season was over in the month of November. They beat A&M to finish the season before beating Texas Tech in the Texas Bowl, and in total they went 9-3. And finally, the last team we need to talk about is the Alabama Crimson Tide, who were dominating under Nick Saban 10 years ago. That 2015 roster had Jake Coker, Derrick Henry as their starting running back with Kenyon Drake and Damian Harris. Then you had Calvin Ridley and O.J. Howard in the receiving game. Bama ended up having a special season as they knocked off number 20 Wisconsin in week 1, but then somehow lost at home to number 15 Ole Miss. This would be a bit of a setback, but then they go on a crazy winning streak. They beat UL Monroe, knock off number 8 Georgia, beat Arkansas, knock off number 9 A&M, beat Tennessee, and then beat number 2 LSU. To finish the year, they then beat Mississippi State on the road, Charleston Southern, Auburn, and then number 18 Florida in the SEC championship game. There were so many ranked teams on that list that they had to beat, and then in the college football playoff, they would destroy Michigan State 38-0, and then beat number 1 Clemson in a classic. Bama ended up winning the national championship, and they were peaking under Nick Saban then. So yeah, in today's video, we talked about where the SEC teams were 10 years ago, and what do you think? What surprised you? What shocked you? And what has changed in 10 years? Be sure to let me know your thoughts down below. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out one of the videos on the end screen. Hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.